All right, guys, we're diving into chapter 2 on Roar, Stacy Sims' book on training and nutrition for the female athlete. Check out chapter 1 if you haven't. Buy the book, read it, follow along with us. Chapter 2 is demystifying and mastering your menstrual cycle. As a man, I learned a lot of stuff I didn't know. And I'm actually fired up because it's really helpful information. So the most elite, the highest level athlete that I work with right now is Zoe Atkins. She is X Games gold medalist, World Cup gold medalist, super pipe, free ski super pipe. She's awesome. And all of this information is fantastic for me to kind of have a conversation with her around training and nutrition and how we can kind of schedule her bigger days around her menstrual cycle, which I thought was pretty cool. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a conversation. I've been in this game for 15 years and I've heard like chatter about it, but it's never been laid out in a way that I was like, oh, that's something I can utilize with my athletes. That's something an athlete, I could have them read this chapter and they'd be like, oh, there's some things I can change, some stuff to do around there. Mm-hmm. So was there anything that like jumped out right away from this chapter for you, Alex?
Well, I think the first note I took is super basic, but it is probably shocking how many guys in particular don't know the days and phases of a menstrual cycle, to be honest with you. So you've got two phases. You've got your follicular and luteal phases, right? Mm-hmm. And then ovulation occurs in the middle, and there are changes in hormone releases based on what part of each phase you're in. So I know in my education, there were always strategies that people theoretically talked about of training where your hard days might fall within these phases. But since then, nobody has really tried to use it in my career.
Yep.
So I think that this book does a really good job of explaining clearly what hormone peaks at which time, what are its effects on training, and how you might be able to take advantage of the timing, for lack of better explanation.
Yep.
Like one thing that I thought was really interesting is that typically the time where people show their best performance and might be able to really push things is during the low hormone phase, basically immediately following their period.
Yep.
And I've known several female athletes that I've coached in the past where it was almost like training was brought down during that time.
Yeah. Because
we were, trying to account for stress or nutrition or whatever it is. So we certainly were missing the window.
Yeah, totally. I agree. I did not know. I knew there was a high hormone phase and a low hormone phase just because there's been a lot of chatter like in the last 6 months kind of about that on Instagram, and just if you're keeping your finger in the national conversation. But average menstrual cycle being 28 days. I have a wife. I knew that. But I did not know it can range from 21 days to 35 days.
Yeah.
So one thing Stacy talks about a lot is we track everything else. Track your cycle, and then we can make training decisions around that cycle. Mm-hmm. And so you got your follicular phase, which is on average 1 through 14. That's your low hormone. That's when you're most like a dude. Mm-hmm. So training power, training speed, big lifts, big strength stuff makes a ton of sense then. And then luteal phase, high hormone phase. That's as you're going into menstruation. That's day 14 to day 28, and that's where training can feel and be a little bit harder. So that's where we would do more of our endurance training, or some of the days that don't require as peak intensity.
Yep.
It's still hard training, but just adjusting it a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I had a note there, 5 days after your cycle, estrogen production starts to ramp up. There's a surge around day 12, causes ovulation, and then peak estrogen and progesterone levels are about 5 days before menstruation, and that's when PMS symptoms can show up, and that is definitely a hormonal thing, and that can be cramping, it can be bloating, a lot of those kind of things. So knowing your timing of that, we can adjust kind of what the training looks like, which I thought was a huge takeaway.
Yeah, and this didn't come specifically from the book, but I listened to some podcast interviews with Stacy, and oftentimes her recommendation is just start the conversation. Have people tracking what their cycle looks like and how they feel throughout different phases of their cycle, because ultimately you can gain a whole lot of insight. Even if we have these things written down and done through studies, if we know how somebody feels, then we can pick the right days to really encourage them to train hard.
Well, yeah, mentally I'm thinking a young female athlete, say you're psyched in the gym and you're doing back squat and day 5 of your cycle, you hit a PR, everything feels good. And then we back squat again, day 20 of your cycle, everything feels heavy, you're 10% lower on your weights. Mm-hmm. And mentally that can be like, I've been sleeping well, I've been eating well, I've been doing everything right, and I'm getting weaker. So like mentally that's not good. But if we know like, oh, okay, like things are going to feel harder, doesn't mean they are harder. It's just hormones are different.
Yep.
You take the psychological, like, oh, I'm doing something wrong. It's like, no, that's just your physiology. And in the future, we're not going to go for a big number on day 20.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't make sense.
I actually put this note in here as I was reading, as one of the take-home messages to me is that there are legitimate, real physiological explanations to a lot of the symptoms and feelings people might express here. So it's not just a you thing. There are legitimate reasons behind these, and I think helping have that conversation can only support people to understand where they're at and how we can work around it.
Yep.
I mean, things going all the way from carbohydrate metabolism to like blood volume changes,
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So it's not you're crazy. It's a real thing, and let's work with it instead of fight it. I thought this was fascinating. Hormones are favorable for performance once menstruation starts. Mm-hmm. So as soon as you start bleeding on your menstrual cycle, it's actually a good time to start training hard if you feel good, right? And even if you don't feel good, it's something you can experiment with in the gym or in a training session. I wouldn't experiment with it like during like most important event of
not on competition day.
On competition day, but it's something you can experiment with through your training cycles. Mm-hmm. And so your follicular phase begins day 1 of menstrual bleeding, which is cool. Another fascinating bit, and this impacts training decisions, is VO2 max and lactate threshold remain constant throughout your cycle. So both of those things are around your aerobic capabilities, pretty much, and endurance stuff. So even when you're in that really high hormone phase, training based off of VO2 max and lactate threshold is a really good tool that won't be as...
It's fairly stable.
Yeah, it's stable. It won't be devastating where it's like day 5, I feel really strong. Day 20, I don't feel as strong. That kind of thing, which I thought was like pretty cool to have that conversation with our female athletes. Stacey has a bunch of kind of general guidelines around preparing for cramping, preparing for kind of like the PMS phase. GI issues are possible, mood swings are possible, spatial cognition can be a little bit harder during those days just before your cycle starts. So kind of like get the book and read through that, see what her recommendations are, and kind of following that and having those conversations with our athletes can be really interesting.
Yeah, there are tons of little just nutritional tidbits that can be helpful,
Totally.
And I think as a coach, if you can steer somebody in the right direction, then it gives them a lot of confidence because you're not just listening to a problem and basically saying like, oh, I'm sorry, that's too bad.
Yeah.
But you might have something that can legitimately help them.
Totally.
And that instills a ton of confidence between coach and athlete.
Yeah, it's good for the athlete, it's good for the coach, and it gives you something you can do. And it feels good to do things as opposed to like, well, just wait 5 days and you'll feel a little better.
Yep.
So I thought this was probably one of the big points I read was Dr. Sims does not think manipulating your cycle with oral contraceptives is a good play. There are performance hindering side effects because an oral contraceptive is typically going to increase estrogen and progesterone kind of throughout your month, which can be unhelpful for performance. She likes natural methods, and if manipulating timing of the cycle, she liked an IUD or a vaginal ring where it's a localized hormone as opposed to a system-wide hormone.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting. Again, that's something like a young athlete has to decide with her parents and her doctor, but at least being able to have the conversation with the parents and the athlete, like, hey, this is what happens with a performance-based with an oral contraceptive where there's some other options that could be better for your daughter, for your sister, just overall throughout your kind of athletic and performance career, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, and she included some examples of when they've tried to use OCs to control timing or like get teams on similar cycles so that it would be predictable around competition rates, and that's not always beneficial. There are plenty of kind of high level cases of people not performing as well as they had hoped to in big competitions, and could be an effect of really trying to manipulate some of these beneficial hormone changes through oral contraceptives. So
yeah, and she had examples of people that were in PMS that hit like world record PRs.
Yeah.
Just being aware of that and then making decisions based on the data that we have. And there's a lot of people putting out good data right now. So just keeping your nose in that. Another important bit from this chapter is REDS, which used to be the female athlete triad, but REDS is a lot more accurate. So relative energy deficiency in sport. This impacts men and women. And it used to be like, oh, a woman's too lean, she trains too hard, and that's why she's got the female athlete triad. That's not true. It's an energy thing. So it's typically like a malnutritioned athlete. So we need to focus on getting better nutrition to our athletes, and it's preventable even in very fit, very active, very athletic women.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are it's much more than just a triad of, three basic things to look for. But if you are sending yourself deep into this energy deficient state, then there is a whole cascade of issues that can be caused long term. And the take home point for me is that with good education and trying to help people make the right nutritional choices is completely preventable.
Totally. And so if you're missing your cycle as a woman, it's not because you're too athletic. It's most likely because your energy needs are not being met. And that's something that we can impact without pulling you from sport. If it gets bad enough, like there can be a psychological piece of that. This happens in men and women, so it's not just a woman thing, and it's not from being too lean. And she re-emphasized that.
Yeah, and she actually gave a checklist in the book too of how you can evaluate what stage of Red S you might be falling into. And then what sort of a strategy, or should you be limited participation in sport, should be pulled from sport. So these are things that they can be tracked and they can be accounted for too.
100%. And then just like the last thing that I thought was really important was like, if you lose your period, it is something you need to address. So all female athletes, if you're on a contraceptive that prevents you from having your period, it's a different thing. But if you lose it during training or sport, she has an action plan for correcting it. And she kind of lays out very specifically, here are supplements, here are some medicines that you can take, how many carbs to get per pound of body weight during your luteal phase, how many carbs during your follicular phase, what to do pre-training, what to do post-training. So diving into the book and being aware that if you do start losing your cycle, you want to act on that quickly as opposed to ignore it for 3, 6, 9 months, couple of years, because there's a lot of negatives that come from that health-wise, especially for women.
Absolutely.
So that's a good trigger. REDS is important. Paying attention to contraceptives and performance is important. And then tracking your cycle and using that information to guide training decisions. That was kind of my takeaways from that chapter.
Yeah, we're pretty much on the same page there. I think so far I'm really impressed with the book. I think it's got a ton of actionable insight. And I definitely think it's things that are going to help me as a coach in the future.
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely going to make me a better coach. So there's chapter 2. Read up, get your book. We'll do chapter 3 soon.